Welcome to Georgetown. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to Georgetown University in Qatar and to welcome our distinguished guest and public intellectual, Professor Ilan Pappé. Ilan Pappé is Professor of History at the University of Exeter and the Director of the European Center for Palestine Studies. He was born in Haifa in 1954. He received his BA from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in 1978 and his PhD from the University of Oxford in 1984. He founded and directed the Academic Institute for Peace in Gifat Haviva and from 1992 to 2000 and was the chair of the Emil Touma Institute for Palestine Studies in Haifa between 2000 and 2006. Between 1984 and 2006, Professor Pappé taught in the Department of Middle Eastern History and the Department of Political Science in Haifa University. He was forced to leave Haifa University because of his political views, and since 2007, he has been teaching at the University of Exeter. Professor Pappé's research focuses on the modern Middle East, and in particular, the history of Israel and Palestine. He has taught and written on multiculturalism, critical discourse analysis, and on power and knowledge in general. He is author of 20 books, among them The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, which was translated into 15 languages, A History of Modern Palestine, and On Palestine, which he co-authored with Noam Chomsky. His latest book is The Biggest Prison on Earth, A History of the Israeli Occupation. I would like also to take the opportunity to thank our own student, Khulud Al-Ashiba, and Professor Karim Walter for taking the initiative to invite and organize this event. Professor Walter will moderate the question and answer session after the formal lecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ilan Pappé.
Thank you, Dean, for your kind introduction. And I want to thank the Georgetown University in Qatar for inviting me and for all of you of attending here tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here and a great honor. Before I begin my actual talk, I just want to say that since it's always a great opportunity to meet new people and be in places where you haven't spoken before, I want to stress that I would welcome, after the talk, during the question and answer session, also comments and questions beyond the topic, as I'm sure for some of you it's the first time you hear me or listen to me, and I would be very happy to answer questions that also exceed and go beyond the topic of the talk itself. We are, I think, living in a very dangerous time in the Middle East, and this is nothing new. Quite a few years in the history of the region were more dangerous than others. And one of the reasons this is a particularly volatile moment in the history of the region is that I think that we are ending a certain chapter and we are on the brink of a new one, but we haven't yet fully completed the chapter and we haven't yet fully entered the new one. And these are usually chaotic times, and it is a time when there is a vacuum, and people and movements and ideologies which are quick in filling vacuums are not always taking us in the right direction. And in many ways, the Trump declaration about Jerusalem was yet another indicator about the end of a certain era and the beginning of a new one. And that's why, like so many such periods in history, it is a time of both great dangers but also big opportunities when it comes to the particular topic that I'm interested in, which is the future of Palestine. There is a similarity between the Trump, if one can call it the Trump Declaration, and the Balfour Declaration. And by some kind of historical just 100 years passed between the first declaration and the other declaration, and 100 years always gives us the sense that we can look at things more properly when such a period comes to an end. And I think the Trump Declaration in many ways can indicate the end of the Balfour Declaration and its impact on Israel and Palestine. The one similar point between the two declarations is that the background for the declaration, or the reasons for the declaration, themselves are not very important for understanding the significance of these declarations. It doesn't mean that you don't have very good historical analyses that explain why the Balfour Declaration was given, and I'm sure in due course we will have proper scholarly analysis of why did Donald Trump give the declaration about Jerusalem. But the reasons themselves are not that significant for the reality on the ground. Let's talk about the Balfour Declaration. At the time that it was given, it was vague. Britain gave similar declarations and promises to other groups in the Middle East within the context of the end of the First World War, and we probably would have forgotten about the Balfour Declaration had it not been incorporated into the British mandate in Palestine. And in that way, it contributed to the 1948 Nakba, to the 1948 catastrophe. So it was the incorporation of the Balfour Declaration, or the decision by politicians after Balfour to take the declaration and turn it into actual policy, that made the Balfour Declaration significant. Because on the face of it, it was not a very significant document, nor was it meant, I think, to be very significant at the time. Now, I don't know yet whether Trump declaration is that significant, of course, because not enough time has passed for us to evaluate it. But it already has created such, or generated such a reaction that you can begin, I think, to understand the possible implications of that declaration. And when you look back at the Balfour Declaration, you can see that people on the ground, a year into the Balfour Declaration, already understood the implications of that declaration once it became actual policy by the British government in Palestine. And I think because of the age we live in, the internet, the quicksands we are all kind of standing on, the implications become clearer much faster than they did in the past. It's the nature of the age we live in. So we can surmise already with some certainty some of the major implications, or rather indications, that the Trump Declaration brings with it into the area as a whole, and into Palestine and Israel in particular. The first point, and I think this is really new, because some of the implications I will talk about, I don't think Trump or the Trump era is in particularly originating anything new there. It just accelerates ongoing processes and continuous patterns of policies that were there before. But what is really new in the declaration is the total disregard for international law. Now, when I say total disregard to international law, I do not mean necessarily that the US policy before Trump with regard to the Palestine question was particularly strong on respecting international law. That would be going too far. In fact, the US tolerated quite willingly Israeli violations of the international law since 1948 until today. So this is nothing new. But when you examine closely the American position on international law with regard to the Palestine question, you can see that at least the discourse is one of respect to the international law. There always came an analysis and an explanation, I would say apologetics as well, that tried to clarify why this loyalty to the international law does not translate into American policy on the ground. A very good example for this is the American position on the Israeli settlements in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Until today, if you open the State Department website, you will see that the Jewish settlements in the occupied territories are regarded as violating the international law. That doesn't mean, of course, that the US did anything to change that reality. But the declared position was that international law is important, and if someone violates international law, the Americans, at least on an ethical level, are against it. What is so remarkable about the Trump, not just the declaration, the whole attitude that followed the declaration, is that there is a clear statement that international law doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter not because there are explanations why the US would allow Israel to violate international law, but actually is not very happy with these violations. No, there is a very clear declaration that Israel is exempt from abiding by the international law. And this is so clear because the Jerusalem issue was the kind of a litmus paper for how far can Israel go in violating international law in its project of taking over Palestine as a project of colonization. It is not a coincidence that even the United States did not dare to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem before 1967. Nor is it a coincidence that the United States never thought of moving actually its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem after 1967, even when the rhetoric of different candidates for presidency usually included such vague promises of transferring the American embassy. Everybody knew that this would not be done unless there would be kind of a statement that peace has come to reign in the Holy Land, or that the Arab-Israeli conflict has come to an end. But here comes a president who says that the United Nations decision of 1947, the United Nations decision of 1949, the United Nations condemnation of the Israeli annexation of East Jerusalem are all irrelevant factors in the international attitude towards the question of Palestine. And I think this has implications for us in the next, in years to come, because quite a lot of the Palestinian position, the pro-Palestinian position in the West, I would say even of the peace camp in Israel, definitely of some of the international organizations that are interested in Palestine, is based on the international law, or the positions for how to solve the problem, how to end the violence, engage directly with international law. Now, if we take international law out of the equation, we are creating a new reality on the ground, and I will come back to it. But I really think we should not speak anymore when it comes to what should be done next with such certainty that international law is on our side, or that international law can offer solutions to the ongoing oppression of the Palestinians on the ground. So international law is out in many ways, and of course this has implications beyond Palestine into the rest of the Middle East, when we're thinking about the future of Iraq or Syria and other places in the world where some sort of a system that was created after the Second World War becomes irrelevant, not just because it doesn't have the power of sanctions, which was its main weakness until today, but it doesn't have the support of the main superpower in the world. And that's really something that for years to come, I think we will see the significance. There are three other implications which I would like shortly to spell out that come from this declaration. And they are not necessarily some things that happened during the Trump era alone. I think they were also already happening before, but Trump was a kind of an accelerator. He accelerated certain truths, certain realities that some of us had difficulties in acknowledging and accepting because they really require new thinking on the question of Palestine. One is the end of American role as mediators in the Israel-Palestine question. And this is not a mere issue. If you look at the so-called peace process that began after the 1967 war, you cannot but realize and acknowledge the centrality of the American involvement in initiating this process, in sustaining it, in making it the only game in town. I once looked at the time that Palestinian diplomats who were involved in the so-called peace process or in the Oslo Accord. I once checked how many days a year did they have to spend in Washington to make the peace process alive, or keep it alive. Each one of them spent more than half a year in Washington. So it was really a Pax Americana in many ways. And if this analysis is right, that not only does America end its role as a mediator because it is suspected of not being an honest broker. It never was an honest broker in the Palestine question. But if it really ends its role as a broker altogether, that really means that we are in a new era, because it was very dominant in anything that is connected with the so-called peace process or the diplomatic process. And I think that brings me to the second point. There were times in the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict where diplomacy was not very active. We always have lulls in diplomatic efforts. I think this time it's not just a question of diplomacy resting for a while before it will be resumed. I think we have, with the Trump declaration, have ended diplomacy as the main principal means for ending the problems in Palestine. And I will come back to that in what would replace diplomacy. Because diplomacy cannot deliver anymore any change in the reality on the ground. Of course, if you are pleased with the reality on the ground, you don't mind. But if you would like to change the reality of the ground because you are the oppressed, you are the colonized, you are the ethnically cleansed people, you have to think, what does it mean that diplomacy does not work anymore for changing a reality that gets worse by the day from your perspective? Finally, and I think that is a very logical conclusion, again, provided these two assumptions that I just gave are correct, and time will prove whether it's right or wrong. But if they are correct, it's also the end of the two-state solution as a viable solution for the Israel-Palestine question. And again, this kind of recognition has a lot of many implications for the next few years in terms of anyone who is either active in trying to change the reality or anyone from the outsides who cares about what happens there and would like to play a role in changing the reality. Now, for many people, especially people who believed in, I would say, almost the sanctity of the two-state solution, for many people who saw diplomacy as the exclusive way of changing realities, if this analysis is correct, this is bad news. So the Trump declaration created the fear that it really unfolds a new, dangerous reality where the risks are many and the dangers are plenty. However, if you never, as I did, if you never totally believed in either the two-state solution, or you never saw the Americans as playing a positive role in the history of Palestine or in the history of the peace process in Palestine, and when you thought that diplomacy is not delivering the goods, then maybe this indication that Trump's declaration ended a chapter and opens up for us a new chapter is not just a dangerous moment, but also a moment of new opportunities. And the most important opportunity, or the most important assignment, I would say, that comes from this realization, and I can feel it on the ground in Palestine, in Israel, among the communities around the world which are engaged in one way or another with the Palestine question, the most important initial reaction to that kind of analysis, that means that in those places I'm talking about, the kind of analysis I presented to you is accepted as valid. One has to stress this point. There is a call from bottom up, I would say, for redefining the project of the liberation of Palestine and adapting it to the 21st century. Because the project of the liberation of Palestine suffers from all kinds of diseases that are typical to a project of liberation that for more than 100 years did not liberate 1 square inch of the homeland. So it's not surprising that there is a sense of crisis. There always is a sense of crisis, but 100 years onwards, if more than 100 years onwards, there is a sense of crisis. But the Trump declaration indicates the need, which many people, of course, were aware of. I'm not inventing the wheel here, but more and more understand that there is a need to redefine what does it mean to liberate Palestine in 2018. Does it mean the same thing that it meant in the 1960s, where the inspiration came from liberation theologies in the Third World, where the Kalashnikov and Che Guevara were more or less the iconic emblems of such a liberation? Probably not. Does it mean that what came afterwards, the Fatah stages program, the incorporation and integration into the Pax America was the right way leading to acceptance of the two-state solution, especially with the weakness of the organization after the events in Lebanon in 1982? Probably not. I think, as I said, I think Trump also indicates that this strategy and tactics did not work either. So I'm not going to, don't expect me now to give you my formula for the liberation of Palestine in 2018. I have my own ideas, but I will not share them right now. But I do think it's important to indicate, as a scholar in this respect, that what a lot of Palestinians understand, that there is a need for redefining the liberation project. So many things happened since the last time the Palestinian movement defined its liberation project. We have to go back to 1968. Well, between 1968 and 2018, the whole scene has changed so dramatically that it makes sense that the 1968 discourse in many parts, not in all parts, but in many parts, is irrelevant to 2018. The second kind of consequence of this, and this is also not just my opinion, I also feel it's happening, so I'm also reporting it, not just suggesting it, is a new role for what is called in Arabic, Arab Thamani wa Arba'in, or the Palestinian minority inside Israel. They always took the back seat on Palestinian strategy. They always felt, until 1967, they felt actually quite ashamed because they had this image of the people who stayed behind. Why did you stay behind where everybody else was expelled? There was a misunderstanding of how the Palestinian minority in Israel was created, but they were called prerogatively, the dukhala, the people from within, and so on. This changed a bit after 67. 67, ironically, united two very important groups of Palestinians. After 19 years of separation, the Palestinians of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip united with the Palestinians in the rest of Palestine. But even then, there was always this strategic decision by people who were leading the Palestinian community in Israel, but also by the PLO, that the Palestinians in Israel cannot play an important role in strategizing the old Palestine definition of the project of liberation. I think this has to change. I think the Palestinians in Israel should play a far more decisive role for the mere reason that you cannot define the project of liberation of Palestine without taking into account in the vision the fate of the Jews who live in Palestine. And the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the only Jews they know are soldiers and settlers. The Palestinians in Israel have a much more intimate knowledge of the Jewish community, of the Jewish society, of its weaknesses, its strengths, and its more complete human existence. And therefore, they would bring into the project of liberation something that wasn't there from the very beginning, and I will explain in a moment why. I can understand why, but it's a fact. There was never, ever a clear Palestinian statement of how do Palestinians see the future of the 6 million Jews who live today within a Jewish state. What is the vision for that? Until 1968, the vision was of the Zionist movement as a colonialist movement. And when you envision a movement as a colonialist movement, the solution for the colonialists is to go back home. And therefore, you don't need to think too much about integration. You think about reversal of the historical process. Now, this has changed, but the movement was too far to the other side. Then came the idea of the two-state solution. Well, you accept them as a nation state over 78% of the homeland. Not surprisingly, it did not work, because if you think about it, it's really not something that is based on any fair or just assessment of what happened in Palestine and Israel in the last 100 years. But what can work then? What is the message? It's very important. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that there are any things today that the Palestinians can offer to the vast majority of the Israeli Jewish electorate that would be accepted. Don't misunderstand me. I think the Israeli electorate today opposes the two-state solution, the one-state solution. What they want is, and this is the vast majority of the Israeli Jews, they want the status quo to continue, and they want to use what they see now as an exceptional good window of opportunities, the Trump era, to improve the status quo, namely annex officially large parts of the West Bank and sort of inflict the last blow on any Palestinian hope for changing the reality on the ground. And this manifests itself in the new legislation in the Israeli parliament, in the way that the political map in Israel has been shaped in the last 10 years. We are in for a very rough ride with this current Israeli regime in terms of legislation and unilateral actions which are meant to make Palestine from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean an exclusive Jewish space with an apartheid system that will control the Palestinians in different kinds of regimes. It's already unfolding in front of our eyes, but it's not yet fully legitimized. Trump gave them the idea that now is the time to legitimize it because the international climate can change in the near future. So there is a sense of urgency in Israel now to complete the making of the Israeli apartheid republic effect that could not easily be changed or reversed by a changing international realities or changing regional realities. They also read the regional map and they say, now is the time, I don't have to explain this to you, that they see the development in Saudi Arabia is very positive and brilliant as far as they are concerned, It gives them another sense that this is the moment. This is the moment to tie the loose ends of the Zionist project and bring it into full completion. Because what the Israelis don't like is the sense that they have not yet completed fully the project. Now, in order to react to this, part of the things that we do in the academia that analyzes the situation in Palestine, I think is relevant as a tool of assistance, I will call it, to the need to redefine the project of liberation in Palestine. I don't think academics will redefine the project of liberation, but I think there has to be a closer dialogue between the academics and the activists and the politicians for such a redefinition. Nobody should take upon themselves exclusively such a redefinition. There used to be a time in the 60s and the 70s, not only in Palestine, all over the Arab world, where academics and politicians used to work much more in tandem and produced synergetically quite exciting, constructive perceptions of reality. We have lost this dialogue, and I think we have to renew it, especially in the case of Palestine. And this is where an old-new paradigm is now, as many of you may know, is now exciting everyone who does Palestine as an academic topic around the world. And this is the paradigm of settler colonialism. And it's not surprising that settler colonialism, which is very different from colonialism, became such an attractive tool for both academics and activists, not just to explain what happened in Palestine in the last 100 years, but what should happen in Palestine in the next 100 years. Because settler colonialism, as many of you know, is the idea that groups of Europeans left Europe because they were persecuted for economic or cultural or religious reasons, and they settled in someone else's land, creating a new nationality for themselves. And the main, and this happened in the United States as well, and the best way of recreating a new nationality, if you are a refugee from Europe, was to overcome the indigenous native population. You appropriate their history, you appropriate their identity, and in many cases, unfortunately, you eliminate them in order to create your new homeland. It happened in the United States, it happened in Canada, it happened in Latin America, Australia, New Zealand. It was attempted in South Africa and Algeria, but failed. And it is in the process of making in Palestine. We don't know yet. We do not know yet whether it will be a successful story or a failed story. Now, it's very easy to analyze Zionism as settler colonialism. It's much more difficult to say, how do you decolonize a settler colonialist project that already has a state that's already recognized internationally in the 21st century? And here, there is no easy answer for that. What I can say is that some of the answers, but by no means all of the answers, or beginning of answers, have been given by the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, which is an interesting project because the movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement is not replacing the Palestinian national movement or any movement on the ground in providing a vision for the future. It doesn't do that. It just offers means of pressuring Israel to change the reality on the ground because there is no project of liberation on the Palestinian side, because there is a confusion on the Palestinian side, and there is activism that does not want to be idle. I think that's the main reason why it was conceived and why it became so popular and why the Israelis are now getting quite crazy in their reactions to such a movement, and they disallow the Quakers, the American Quakers, to come to Israel. The movement that saved more Jews in the Holocaust than anyone else is now banned from coming to Israel because they supposedly support the BDS movement. The importance of the BDS was its focus on human rights and civil rights. And somewhere in the redefinition of the project of liberation, taking into account the end of diplomacy, taking into account that international law cannot work anymore, taking into account the death of the two-state solution, somewhere in the alternatives that we will seek, we will have to remember that the 21st century is a century of human rights and civil rights, much less national rights. And if you are open enough about this idea of putting nationalism on a more marginal, you don't want to get rid of nationalism or national right in that respect. You want the national movement to be very strong, of course, but to put it in a different perspective and relocate human rights and civil rights at the center of the agenda of change, given the realities that Israel is creating on the ground, this would be the most powerful tool for change. How exactly you fight for human rights and civil rights? Well, nobody has a magic formula for that. We would all like such fights not to be violent, because violence gives a pretext to the colonizer, the occupier, to use more violence against you, usually in the form of collective punishment, and you don't want that to happen. On the other hand, if you just sit idle, it doesn't change the reality either. I will finish my talk by giving you one example, and I hope I'm not exaggerating its importance, but for me, it has all the ingredients of what can help change the reality while remaining a realist, knowing that the political elites in the West have not changed their point of view on Israel and Palestine, knowing that only the civil society has really shifted, and dramatically, towards adopting the Palestinian cause, while remaining realistic, taking some inspiration from something that happened in Jerusalem, as you know, 2 months ago, when the Israelis introduced new devices into the entrance of Al-Aqsa Mosque, and everybody thought there's nothing you can do to force the Israelis to remove anything they want to introduce. And a quiet demonstration, at first not at all supported by the Palestinian Authority, only then they decided to support it, a quiet demonstration of people who were tolerating Israeli beating and all kinds of other means that they were used, a quiet demonstration that lasted hours convinced the Israelis to remove the devices that they introduced on the entrance to Masjid al-Aqsa. Now, you can say, come on, this is nothing. So now you can enter more freely the mosque than before. How can you compare this kind of success to a new reality of justice and equality and liberation? Well, I think sometimes the small models, bottom up, are far more important, especially at the time that politics is so cynical, when political elites do not care really about changing realities. It's quite good to look more closely at the realities that are built on the ground and get them as a model for the future. This is also true about the way Palestinians and Jews live in the Galilee, where relatively the relationship is far more better than any other part in Palestine, as a model maybe for a binational state, maybe for a democratic state, because we will have to find a replacement for the two-state solution. It's already dead, but we have not been invited to the funeral yet. It's in the morgue. The body is in the morgue. But every now and then someone comes, takes it out, puts some life into it, dons it with new clothes and thinking it's alive. But we should have a period of mourning and then move on. But this is where I think academics, activists can begin to fill the vacuum with ideas and dialogues, because unfortunately the politicians, the political elites, and the other elites will be the last one to join the wagon. They would not initiate a new journey, but they might join a new journey if it would have a clear beginning and an understanding that it is possibly the best path forward, and that the old way should be deserted. Thank you very much.